Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an absolute honor. And I hope you and your families are healthy and safe. We are living in unprecedented times. We have lived through crisis before, but none of us have ever seen anything like this in our lifetimes. COVID-19 is clearly pressure testing the political, social, and economic fibers of our world and our future. And healthcare has been hit the hardest, both spiritually and financially. While hospitals' balance sheets and cash flows show serious strain, hospitals' physicians and nurses and staff continue to battle on the front lines every day while caring for patients, showing compassion, and saving lives. I'm confident as ever we will beat COVID-19 and healthcare will come back stronger than ever. But accomplishing this will require collaboration, innovation, and strong leadership, and most importantly, caring. The World Medical Innovation Forum represents all these things and so much more. Last year, the World Medical Innovation Forum launched a $30 million joint initiative with Bayer and some of Mass General Brigham's most respected clinicians and researchers. Together with Bayer, Mass General Brigham is working to discover novel drugs for chronic lung disease with an urgent focus on chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. COPD is one of the most devastating diseases on our planet. It affects over 65 million people worldwide, and it kills more than 3 million people each year. Research on COPD is clearly an extraordinary need that has gone unmet for far too long. But that need is now being addressed through an extraordinary dream team of researchers and physicians who are working together to learn more about COPD. Bayer and Mass General Brigham staff have organized into cross-functional groups to battle COPD, serving as a model for how organizations with complementary expertise can partner together, innovate, and drive progress. Together, this team will beat COPD. Together, they will save lives and transform the quality of life for patients who have this debilitating lung disease. It is now my great honor and privilege to introduce one of the individuals driving this important partnership, Dr. Joerg Moeller, the head of R&D for Bayer Pharma. Joerg is responsible for the planning and execution of all global research and development across the entire portfolio of Bayer Pharmaceuticals. Joerg's bold vision, strong leadership, and innovative mindset have played an instrumental role in the development of life-saving solutions for Bayer and for patients throughout the world. In the past 6 years, he has led a team of over 7,000 researchers and scientists that have contributed an incredible 9 products to approval. We are absolutely thrilled to be partners with Borg and his team and are honored to have him here to share his thoughts on where we are today and our path to tomorrow. I would also like to introduce a good friend of mine, Janet Wu of Bloomberg, who will serve as our interviewer today. Janet has been a fixture in the Boston media landscape for more than 20 years and is a strong example of excellence for journalism. We are thrilled to have Joerg and Janet with us. Congratulations.
As we know, an enormous amount of pressure and attention is on the pharma industry right now to both develop a vaccine as well as treatments for the novel coronavirus. Joerg, could you put the urgency of this in context for us? Is this the most pressure you have ever faced in your career?
Thanks for the question, Janet, and also thanks for the very kind introduction to both of you. Not sure whether this is the biggest pressure the industry has faced, but I think John's described it very well in his introduction when he used the word unprecedented. And I think that's what it is, because the coronavirus affects us not in one or two areas of our lives. It basically affects us in our private lives. It affects us in the way we can or cannot communicate or commute or travel. It affects us in our professional lives. And of course, it puts also an enormous pressure on healthcare and healthcare systems. And I think that is truly unprecedented. And it is an enormous challenge for us actually as mankind.
Bayer invented chloroquine back in the 1930s. How did antimalarials come to be considered as possible treatments for COVID-19? What are the similarities between the two diseases that would lead to that?
Well, I think early in this millennium in 2003, we had a SARS epidemic in Asia. And during that time, Chinese researchers came across in vitro testing of the antiviral activity of chloroquine. So I think when we were hit with the coronavirus pandemic, those researchers went back and also tested chloroquine against coronavirus infections. And so we first saw in vitro tests indicating antiviral activity, and then we had our first more anecdotal reports of small clinical studies, mostly in China, because that's where we had the most cases initially. This is meanwhile led to a situation where also governments have requested support in terms of provision of chloroquine. But I want to emphasize at this day and age, this is still an investigational drug. Chloroquine is approved for, as you rightly point out, for treatment of malaria and certain forms of rheumatoid arthritis. It is not approved for regular treatment of coronavirus. In China, we have, since a couple of weeks, approval for emergency treatment of coronavirus infection with chloroquine. And this has been followed by also other governments issuing emergency treatment guidelines and approving the use of chloroquine on an experimental basis. And because we need adequate and well-designed trials to really assess the benefit-risk ratio of treatment of coronavirus infections with chloroquine, this is why we at Bayer also support gathering such data in adequate and well-controlled trials. And that's why we work together, for example, with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. That's why we work with the Public Health Research Institute in Hamilton, Canada, to set up such studies in a well-controlled fashion to really have a solid database that allows physicians and scientists around the globe to really assess the potential of chloroquine in treating those patients.
Joerg, as a follow-up to that, I know you're very busy right now trying to develop new drugs for COVID-19, but are you hopeful that perhaps other existing drugs could prove to be effective treatments if they do undergo the adequate study?
Yeah, I spent these days indeed in a lot of virtual meetings, also with my colleagues, the R&D leaders of other companies, with leaders of regulatory affairs, but also of government institutions. And we are following a number of different avenues. The probably fastest potential way to treatment would be repurposing existing drugs, such as chloroquine, and evaluate their efficacy and safety in treating coronavirus infections. But then there's, of course, as you also heard in the introduction, development of vaccines. And what is striking is the level of collaboration we are experiencing these days. It's also for me an unprecedented level of collaboration in the industry, but also with regulatory agencies, because we all recognize time is of the essence. And the sooner we are able to effectively help patients that are infected by coronavirus, the better off we are, because the consequences are very significant, as we all know, from a healthcare perspective, but also from an economic perspective, obviously.
Joerg, I want to share with the audience more about your work and the question, how do you continue drug development when your labs are shut down and not all of your scientists and researchers can even get to work?
Well, it's an interesting question. And sometimes I look back and think, well, if any of us would have said by the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, that in about 8 weeks, a very significant proportion of all of us would work from home, I don't think anybody would have said that is possible and doable without dire consequences for the organization. So I'm really amazed what indeed has been possible. Here at Bayer, we probably have about 80% of our employees that can work from home actually do work from home. But of course, there are roles, as you point out, that are impossible to conduct when you stay home. If you are a lab technician or you're an animal caretaker, these are roles where people have to go to their workplaces every day. So what we have done is we focused on what are the very crucial roles that have to be on site. Production workers, because that's a clear imperative. Keep production ongoing, because if we have the inability to even produce effective medicines, such as anti-infectives, also to treat, for example, pneumonia, then of course the consequences would be even more severe. And so we have quickly established what are the quintessential roles that have to be on site. Everybody else we have directed to work from home. And we have focused on what are the most critical activities. So our focus in research was to keep ongoing experiments running and try to avoid that we had to stop ongoing experiments. We have to some extent pushed out starting new experiments, and in a way the same applied for clinical studies. Also there, our focus was to keep ongoing studies supported and running. And naturally, as you can imagine, when you run studies on a global scale, you are also affected differently, driven by the different geographies and the time interval with which the different continents and countries are going through the pandemic. But I have to say, and a big thanks to my colleagues, I was enormously positively surprised how well this has been working out. We just recently have completed the clinical portion of one of our most important phase 3 drugs that we are developing for diabetic kidney disease. It's a large global outcome study with a couple of thousand patients, and we were able to keep 99.7% of patients in that study. And I think that's a really remarkable achievement, and we were not forced to stop prematurely any of our ongoing preclinical studies. So I think that is testimony to the colleagues' abilities to focus and support the work that was ongoing and focus on really what is important and keep the top priorities straightened out.
Joerg, speaking of trials, we know that the path to getting a drug through approval and to market is a very long timeline. Congratulations on being able to keep some of your trials for these critical diseases on track. But do you see that that timeline now is going to be longer because of the challenges we face now in work?
I think it depends. I think we will see an impact on timelines for maybe studies that are being started new. But I can also share with you that in our ongoing discussions with regulatory agencies and regulatory policymakers, I also see a great deal of flexibility without lowering the standards. And I was involved in a number of discussions also with FDA Commissioner Hahn, for example, and I can truly state that FDA really works with industry to see what is possible and doable, trying to also accelerate treatment options for COVID-19 patients. So that's a phenomenon and a situation that I see around the globe. And also a big thanks, going back to what I said earlier, I see a great deal of collaboration, not only in the scientific community, but also in our collaboration with regulatory agencies.
Joerg, how do you think that this truly global crisis has forever changed research and development in the pharma industry?
A very good question. I believe, indeed, when we get out of this pandemic, I don't think we will be where we were before going into it. And there may be, as difficult as it may be able to see it right now, there will be, in my view, opportunities coming out of that. For example, we are also involved in opening our compound libraries to allow cross-company sharing of compound libraries. I think that would have been something that would be very difficult to agree upon just not so long ago. And I'm hoping that this collaborative spirit, working on something together, working on a challenge together, the speed of decision making, the solution orientation, the teamwork that we are seeing, I hope that we can keep some of that, because at the end of the day, I think we're all going to benefit if we are able to change long existing behaviors in that direction. And that would be really a positive change, driven by the fact that we all have to go through this very difficult situation right now.
Joerg, this crisis has started to reveal some pretty incredible and unprecedented partnerships, as you allude to, including public and private partnerships. Can you tell us some of the things that Bayer is doing in this crisis?
Well, we first started to try to support our communities. Actually, our employees brought up the idea, well, we have testing machines, we have PCR testing machines. Can we make them available to clinical laboratories and hospitals? We have ventilator machines that we use for our animal testing. These are machines intended to be used in humans. We just repurpose them. So we made those available. Then, as I mentioned, we work across companies and with regulators trying to accelerate innovative and new medicines that can be used to fight COVID-19. We have tried to accelerate some of our programs where we believe those mechanisms can be useful to treat COVID-19 infections. And mentioned earlier in our interview, we are also supporting the creation of evidence for repurposing of drugs and are working with a number of preeminent institutions to also try to speed up those developments. So it really, in a very short period of time, has stretched us in quite a number of different directions. But I'm impressed by how well the organization and the industry and regulators have really risen to the challenge, and how quickly we have aligned behind a single cause here.
This is, as we are reminded, the World Medical Innovation Forum. I am speaking to you from Boston, and you are in Germany. And can you give us that perspective of Germany and where they are in the crisis now, and how Bayer has stepped up to help with the testing, even deploying some equipment? Do you see that a lot of global companies, such as yours, will have to become part of that effort for us to get on the other side of this pandemic?
Yeah, I think we are seeing that different countries, different geographies are impacted at different time points. And that is also how you see then, of course, healthcare systems to be impacted. Ironically, I read some minutes of the board meeting of the Pharmaceuticals division from early February. And there you could see COVID was mentioned, but it was still at the beginning of the pandemic. And about 4 weeks later, also Germany went into a lockdown, and people basically had to stay home, and we followed and asked people who could work from home to really do that. And Germany has, by doing so, I think, fairly well, under the circumstances, well in parentheses, weathered the crisis. And I think those measures were quite instrumental. We are now seeing some easing up of those measures. And I'm right now a little bit concerned, because easing up those measures doesn't mean the pandemic is over. And I think we need to also remind the public that as we try to ease some of the measures, it doesn't mean the risk is over, and that certain prudent behaviors like social distancing, wearing a mask, should no longer be followed. Especially, I think, as we are easing up, it is especially important that we maintain some of those measures, because otherwise we will go and see an increase of new infections again. And by all means, I hope we can try to avoid that.
Joerg, we're down to our last few minutes, and I want to ask you, in your position as head of research and development for the drugs of the future that will hopefully come to pass sooner rather than later, what is the biggest lesson that this pandemic has taught you in your industry?
One of my biggest lessons is that if we just want and focus on a task, the ability to address that challenge is, I wouldn't say unprecedented, but it is enormous. And what I also experience is, in a crisis situation, that we are able to have quick decision making, including quick decision making by government officials who also are challenged enormously in a time like this. And I think also in a word that has been maybe a bit sounded old-fashioned, the word solidarity, I think has become a lot more fashionable, because we are in this together. And I think people have realized that we are in this together, and that joining forces and keeping in mind that there are people that are even more vulnerable than others, and trying to protect those very vulnerable populations, I think is also an important lesson. So I'm hoping that we can keep some of that, because that will, I think, also make the world a better place. if we don't forget some of the lessons coming to aid, giving out protective gear, making donations. These are all important things that I think have come up also at levels that were not seen before. And I'm hoping that this also has been a lasting change on that aspect.
Thank you. That seems to be the perfect note to end our conversation. Dr. Joerg Moeller, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Janet.